My in-laws thought they had destroyed me, that they'd shattered my spirit and cast me out with nothing. They never realized their spectacular downfall was written into a script my husband and I had prepared long before he died. They saw a broken widow, but what they should have seen was a queen, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to call checkmate. Before we dive into the secret I've carried for all these years, please take a second to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment below guessing what the final twist will be. Now, where were we? The moment John and Mary, my late husband's parents, forced me out of the home that Mark and I built together, I honestly thought my life was over. They masterfully painted me as an unstable, grieving widow who couldn't be trusted with her own life. They stole my keys, changed the locks, and quite literally laughed in my face as I drove away with nothing more than 3 pathetic cardboard boxes that were supposed to summarize my entire existence with the love of my life. I was utterly heartbroken, defeated, and ready to give up on everything. But they made one colossal, fatal mistake. They had no idea about the document hidden in the false bottom of my husband's old desk organizer, a document that would not only expose their cruel, greedy lies but would change absolutely everything. Our house wasn't just timber and nails, it was woven from our shared dreams and whispered promises under the moonlight. Mark and I had poured every last drop of our souls into it. I'll never forget the rainy Tuesday we found the plot of land. It was just a forgotten tangle of weeds with one big, stubborn oak tree right in the middle. He'd wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, rested his chin on my shoulder, and whispered, "I can see it, Clara. Our whole life, right here." And for 5 incredible, sun-drenched years, that's exactly what it was. Every paint choice was a weekend-long debate that ended in laughter and splatters on our clothes. We once spent an entire Saturday trying to pick the perfect shade of blue for the bedroom, ending up with more paint on us than on the sample cards. Every crooked picture frame held the memory of a perfect day, like the one we hung after a long hike, our cheeks still flushed from the cold. Every scratch on the hardwood floors was a chapter in our story, from dancing clumsily in the kitchen to our favorite songs, to assembling flat-pack furniture late into the night, fueled by cheap pizza and cheaper wine. It was our sanctuary, built not just with our hands, but with our hearts. Now, Mark had a complicated relationship with his parents. To say it was strained would be the understatement of a century. He loved them, of course, in that dutiful way a son does, but he spent most of his adult life playing referee. John, his father, was a domineering man whose opinions were always presented as indisputable facts. He was a man who believed his way was not just the best way, but the only way. Mary, his mother, was John's loyal echo, a woman who had mastered the art of weaponizing guilt with a single disappointed sigh. They were controlling, suffocatingly so. Their love was a conditional, transactional thing. Mark was this brilliant, tireless diplomat, a constant buffer who absorbed all their meddling and passive aggression, so I rarely had to deal with the full force of it. He'd deflect their invasive questions about our finances, or their not-so-subtle hints about how I should be dressing, or what I should be doing with my career. "Let me handle them, honey," he'd say, running a hand through his hair with a tired, but loving smile. "It's my circus, my monkeys." I loved him deeply for protecting me, but I never truly understood how heavy that burden was until he was gone. And then, just like that, the buffer vanished. A sudden, violent car crash on a slick, rainy night. My world didn't just tilt on its axis, it shattered into a million pieces. The silence in our beautiful, vibrant home became a deafening roar. In the heavy fog of those first few weeks, I was barely functioning. Food had no taste, color seemed dull, and sleep was a stranger. Then, the doorbell rang one afternoon. I found John and Mary on the doorstep, their faces arranged in masks of profound sorrow that, in hindsight, looked much more like grim determination. "Clara, dear," Mary began, her voice dripping with a thick, artificial sympathy that made my skin crawl. "You can't possibly manage all this on your own. This big house, it's too much for you in your delicate state." John placed a heavy, possessive hand on my shoulder. "We've decided we're moving in. Just for a little while. To help you get back on your feet. It's what Mark would have wanted." A cold knot of pure dread formed in the pit of my stomach. The idea of them in our space, in Mark's space, felt like sacrilege. It felt like a violation. But I was so tired, so utterly broken. Their words were a perfectly laid trap. If I said no, I'd be disrespecting my late husband's memory. I could feel the pitying eyes of our neighbors through the windows. I could already hear the family whispers. She's not coping. The pressure was suffocating. So, against every screaming instinct in my body, I caved. I gave a single, defeated nod. And with that one motion, I unlocked the door and invited the Trojan horse right into the heart of my home. It was, without a doubt, the beginning of the end. The first week was a masterclass in quiet, insidious usurpation. It began, innocently enough, in the kitchen. I came downstairs one morning to find Mary humming a cheerful tune while she rearranged my entire spice cabinet alphabetically. "It's just more logical this way, dear," she said, not even bothering to look at me. Mark was always so organized. I felt a flash of anger. I had my own system, a chaotic system that made sense to me. But I swallowed it. It's just a spice rack, right? How petty would I seem? But then, the vibrant, mismatched throw pillows I'd collected from flea markets, each with a story, vanished from the sofa, replaced by soulless, beige department store cushions. Just freshening the place up. It was looking so cluttered, Mary chirped when she saw me staring at them. John, meanwhile, appointed himself the new man of the house. He would walk from room to room with his hands on his hips, pointing out problems that weren't problems. A floorboard he claimed was loose, a faucet he imagined was dripping, the way I loaded the dishwasher. Mark never would have let this place get so run down, he'd sigh. A clear, deliberate jab at me. My profound grief was being systematically twisted into a narrative of my own incompetence. The language they used started to shift, too. It was no longer your house, or Clara's house. It became our son's house. When old friends of mine would come to visit, John and Mary would hold court in the living room, monopolizing the conversation with endless stories of Mark's childhood, completely erasing me and our 5 years of marriage from the picture. They were methodically turning our home into a museum for their son, and I was being demoted to the unstable, untrustworthy curator who couldn't be trusted. I felt like I was shrinking, becoming a ghost in my own home. The very air grew thick with their silent, constant disapproval. My music was always too loud, my cooking wasn't up to Mary's standards, my friends were a bad influence. They were isolating me, one tiny, painful cut at a time. I tried, weakly at first, to push back. "Mary, I'd really rather you didn't rearrange my cupboards," I said one day, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. Her face immediately crumbled into a mask of theatrical hurt. "I was only trying to help. Do you have any idea how hard this is for us? We lost our only son, and now you're pushing us away." Guilt was their sharpest weapon, and they were absolute experts at wielding it. Every time I tried to set a simple boundary, I was painted as the ungrateful, cruel one. They started whispering to relatives on the phone, just loud enough for me to hear, suggesting I was having a breakdown, that I wasn't thinking straight. The final straw came about 2 months into their hostile takeover. John sat me down at the kitchen table, our table, with a stack of my mail he'd opened without permission. "Clara, we need to have a serious talk about finances," he said, his voice dripping with faux gravity. "I've been looking over these bills. You're spending far, far more than you should be." He slid my own credit card statement across the table. A charge for a new dress I'd bought for a friend's wedding was circled in furious red ink. Was this really necessary in your situation? I was speechless. It was my money, from my own savings and from Mark's life insurance. "John, with all due respect, my finances are my business." He actually scoffed. "This is Mark's money, Clara. It's for preserving his legacy, not for frivolous spending. I'll be handling the household accounts from now on. It will be much easier if the utilities are in my name anyway." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a declaration of ownership. The walls were closing in, suffocating me. This was no longer my sanctuary. It was my prison. The house had become an unbearable pressure cooker. I was walking on eggshells 24/7, measuring every word, stifling every impulse. I knew I had to get away, just for a weekend, to clear my head and figure out how I could possibly fight back. I told them I was going to visit my parents. Mary's eyes narrowed into suspicious slits. "Are you sure that's a good idea, dear? Running away from your problems won't solve anything." "I'm not running away," I said, my voice surprisingly firm. I'm visiting my family. I'll be back on Sunday. The look they exchanged as I walked out the door was chilling. It wasn't a look of concern. It was a look of conspiracy, of a plan being hatched. I should have trusted my gut and turned back. Those 2 days with my parents were like breaking the surface after being held underwater. My mom took one look at my haunted eyes and pulled me into a long hug. Honey, they're eating you alive. This isn't helping, it's destroying you. You have to tell them to leave. I will, I promised, feeling a new resolve hardening in my chest. When I get back, I am taking my house back. For good. I drove home that Sunday night feeling stronger and more determined than I had in months, rehearsing the speech in my head, ready for the inevitable fight. But I was not prepared for what I found. As I pulled into the driveway, a cold dread seized me. My favorite rose bushes by the porch, the ones Mark and I had planted in our first spring here, were gone, ripped violently from the ground. I scrambled out of the car and ran to the front door, jamming my key in the lock. It wouldn't turn. I tried again, jiggling it frantically, my heart starting to pound against my ribs. Useless. They had changed the locks. Raw panic set in. I banged on the door with both fists. John! Mary! What's going on? Open this door. After a long moment, the door creaked open a few inches, stopped by the cold steel of a security chain. John's face, framed in the gap, was as cold and hard as granite. You can't be here, Clara. What are you talking about? This is my house. I screamed, my voice cracking. Not anymore, he said flatly, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. We've spoken to the family and to a lawyer. Everyone agrees you're unstable. We're taking over the property to protect Mark's legacy. Behind him, I could see Mary with her arms crossed, a smug, triumphant look on her face. And then I saw them, 3 cardboard boxes stacked carelessly by the door. My things. My clothes, my books, the framed pictures of Mark from my bedside table. You can't do this. I shrieked, the sound tearing from my throat. This is illegal. Our son, our house. Mary yelled from inside, her voice shrill with victory. You were just the woman he happened to marry. We are his blood. John's face was like stone. Your things are on the porch. Take them and leave. If you make a scene, we will call the police and have you removed for trespassing. The door slammed shut. The chain rattled into place. I stood there utterly stunned. Neighbors started peeking through their blinds. The wave of humiliation was so intense it stole the air from my lungs. On the porch, like trash waiting for collection, were 3 boxes. My life, reduced to a pathetic pile of cardboard. I collapsed onto my knees on the lawn, the same lawn Mark and I had so diligently cared for together, and I just wept. I had lost my husband, and now I had lost our home. They had won. The following weeks were a hazy nightmare of shame and despair. I was sleeping on my friend Sarah's uncomfortable sofa, moving through my days in a grief-stricken stupor. I called several lawyers who all gave me the same grim news, because the house was still technically in Mark's name from before our marriage, and we'd never formally added my name to the deed. My rights as a surviving spouse were strong, but it would require a long, ugly, and expensive probate battle to prove. The law was on my side, but the fight would be financially and emotionally brutal. I felt completely and utterly defeated. One rainy afternoon, I finally brought myself to go through the 3 boxes they had so cruelly thrown out. At the bottom of the last box, underneath a sweater that still smelled faintly of Mark's cologne, was his old wooden desk organizer. I'd grabbed it for purely sentimental reasons. As I ran my fingers over the familiar grain of the wood, I felt a tiny, almost invisible seam along the bottom panel. My curiosity piqued, I pressed. With a soft, satisfying click, a false bottom popped up. My breath caught in my throat. Lying beneath it was a thick, sealed manila envelope. My name, Clara, was written on it in Mark's familiar, messy script. My hands were shaking, so badly I could barely tear it open. Inside was a legally binding trust document. As I read, my vision blurred with a fresh wave of tears. Mark, my thoughtful, worried, wonderful Mark, had secretly set up a private trust a year before he died. He had meticulously placed the house and the majority of his financial assets into it. And I, Clara, was named the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. But it was the next part that made my heart stop and then restart with a powerful thud. He had included a special provision known as an interim clause, a no-contest clause. It stated, in bulletproof legal language drafted by a top-tier law firm, that if any family member, specifically naming John and Mary Miller, attempted to contest my ownership of his assets, challenge my rights as his heir, or try to remove me from our home in any way, they would be immediately and entirely disinherited from his entire estate. They would lose every last cent. Tucked behind the legal papers was a handwritten letter. "My dearest Clara," it began. "If you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I am so sorry I'm not there to protect you. I know my parents. I know their love can be a suffocating, controlling thing. I always hoped they would come to see you as I see you, as the absolute center of my world. But I saw the way they looked at you, the way they looked at our house, and I worried. I set this up as a shield for you, a secret weapon. I never told you because I didn't want to start a war while I was still here to be the peacemaker. I hoped you would never, ever have to use this. But I couldn't bear the thought of leaving you unprotected. This house is yours. Our life is yours. Don't you let them take it from you. Live a beautiful life, my love. It's all I ever wanted. All my love, forever, Mark." I sat on Sarah's floor, clutching that letter to my chest, and I cried. But these weren't the tears of despair I had been crying for weeks. These were tears of overwhelming love and of a new, cold, rising anger. He had seen. He had known all along. And from beyond the grave, my husband had just handed me a sword. The game had just changed. The next morning, the broken, grieving widow was gone. In her place was an avenging angel with a briefcase. My first call was not to my in-laws. It was to the most ruthless-looking family law attorney I could find online. I sat in his polished mahogany office and laid the trust document and Mark's handwritten letter on his desk. Mr. Harrison, a man with a shark's smile and eyes to match, read them in complete silence. Finally, he looked up, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Mrs. Miller," he said, tapping the document with a manicured finger. "This isn't just a sword. This is a tactical nuclear weapon. Your husband was a very, very smart man. What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Now," he said, leaning back in his leather chair, "we let them know they've been checkmated." Mr. Harrison explained that while we couldn't just throw them out that exact second, we could make their lives a legal hell. He immediately drafted a cease and desist letter and a formal notice to vacate the property, citing the trust and the now-activated disinheritance clause. Then he made the call. He put it on speakerphone so I could hear every glorious word. John answered, sounding impatient and arrogant. "Hello. Am I speaking with Mr. John Miller?" Mr. Harrison asked, his voice professionally smooth as silk. "Who is this?" John barked back. "My name is David Harrison. I am Clara Miller's attorney regarding the estate of her late husband, Mark Miller." I could just picture John puffing out his chest on the other end. "Ah, yes." The girls finally lawyered up. "Look, counselor, she's not well. We're handling the estate." "I understand," Mr. Harrison said calmly. "Well, I'm calling to inform you of a pre-existing legal trust that places the residence at 123 Oak Street and all associated assets under the sole and exclusive control of Mrs. Miller. It also contains a rather potent interim clause." The silence on the other end of the line was golden. "A what?" John finally stammered, the arrogance gone from his voice. "A disinheritance clause," Harrison clarified, enjoying himself. "One that is triggered by any attempt to remove my client from her home. An attempt which, by changing the locks and denying her entry, you have already made. By your own actions, you and your wife have legally forfeited any and all claims to your son's estate. A process server is on his way to the house as we speak with the official notification. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises before we move for an immediate eviction in the courts. Any resistance, I can assure you, will not go well for you." Sputtering, incoherent noises came from the phone. "That's a lie. That's a forgery. You faked that. I assure you it is quite real and has been legally verified. The choice is simple, Mr. Miller. You can leave quietly with nothing, or you can be dragged through an embarrassing public court battle, lose spectacularly, and still leave with nothing. My client will be by tomorrow morning with a police escort to peacefully enter her property, and begin an inventory of any damages. He hung up without waiting for a response. He turned to me. "Ready?" I nodded, a fierce, triumphant smile spreading across my face for the first time in months. "I'm ready." The next day, as I pulled up with the police car following behind me, the front door was wide open. John stood on the porch, his face a blotchy, purple mask of pure rage. Mary cowered behind him, looking terrified and small. "You can't do this!" he roared as I walked up the path. I stopped directly in front of him and looked him in the eye. All the fear I used to have of him was completely gone. "No, John. This is my house. You trespassed, you caused criminal damage, and you are no longer welcome here." Mary started in with her usual manipulative tears. "Clara, please, after all we did for you, we're family." I pulled the folded letter from my pocket. My voice was clear and loud, for them and for the neighbors who were now openly watching. Mark wrote, "I couldn't leave you unprotected." He wrote, "Don't let them take it from you." He knew you. He knew exactly what you would do the second he was gone. And he protected me from you. I let the words hang in the heavy air. The entire time you were calling me unstable and incompetent, you were proving yourselves to be the greedy, heartless, cruel people he was always afraid you were. The fight just drained out of them. Defeated, they shuffled past me without another word, carrying a few hastily packed bags, their faces a twisted mask of pure, impotent hatred. They scrambled to their car like thieves caught in the act and sped down the street, out of my life forever. I stepped through my own front door alone, and the house was finally, blessedly silent. It was my house again. In that first day back, the silence in the house was different. It wasn't the heavy, crushing silence of grief or the tense, oppressive silence of their occupation. It was peace. It was the quiet, deep satisfaction of a perfectly, flawlessly executed plan. You see, there's one last secret I've kept from all of you this whole time. The final twist. I didn't find that document by accident. The entire performance of the broken, helpless, grieving widow who stumbled upon her own salvation, it was the most difficult, painful role of my entire life. The night before Mark left for his last business trip, the one he never came back from, he sat me down in our living room. I remember the sound of the hard rain against the windows, the same sound as the night of the accident. He took both of my hands, his eyes filled with a concern so deep it frightened me, and he told me everything. He told me about the private trust, the house, the assets, and the interim clause he'd had a lawyer secretly draft. He made me promise that if anything happened, and if his parents started their predictable games, I wouldn't fight back. Not at first. He told me to let them in, to let them think they were winning, to give them every inch of rope they would need to hang themselves with their own bottomless greed. "Let them show the world exactly who they are," he had said, his voice heavy with a sadness I didn't understand at the time. "Let them walk right into the trap I've set. It's the only way you'll ever truly be free of them." So every insult I swallowed, every time I bit my tongue as Mary replaced another piece of my life with her own bland taste, every tear of frustration I cried on my friend's sofa, it was all part of the script. My grief for Mark was agonizingly real, but my helplessness was a calculated act of war. Mark's final gift to me wasn't just a legal sword, it was a detailed battle plan. And I followed it to the letter. The news of what John and Mary had done, and what they had lost as a result, spread through the family like wildfire, but this time, the story was fueled by the undeniable proof of Mark's letter and the legal documents. They lost everything. The inheritance they were certain was theirs, their reputation, their place in the family. I heard they moved into a small, cramped apartment on the other side of town, their lives completely and utterly ruined by the very greed Mark had predicted and prepared for. For me, life began again. I painted the living room a bright, cheerful yellow. I went to the nursery and planted new rose bushes, bigger and more beautiful than the ones they had destroyed. The grief for my incredible husband is a permanent part of me now, but it's no longer a weight that drowns me. It's the soft, warm glow of his incredible love and foresight. His final act wasn't just to protect me, but to show me a strength inside myself I never knew I had. My house is filled with light and laughter and friends again. It's mine, and I am finally, truly at peace. The peace lasted for exactly 4 days. On the 5th night, I was jolted awake by the sound of shattering glass. I leaped out of bed, my heart hammering, and ran to the living room. A rock lay in the middle of the hardwood floor, surrounded by a sea of glass from what had been my front window. My body went cold. The peace I had felt wasn't real. It was just the quiet between acts in a war that was far from over. I called the police, who came, took a report, and told me that without proof of who threw it, there was little they could do. In the following days, the war became psychological. Cars slowing down in front of the house in the middle of the night. Food deliveries I hadn't ordered showing up at my door. That's when I realized the naivete of my victory. I had won the house back, but they were going to make sure I never felt safe in it again. My friend Sarah insisted on staying with me. "You can't be here alone, Clara," she said, her eyes scanning the cardboard-taped window. "They're poisonous. They won't stop." She was right. The legal victory had humiliated them, but it hadn't neutralized them. It had cornered them, and a cornered animal is the most dangerous. The real assault began a week later. Sarah showed it to me, her face pale. It was an article on a local gossip blog featuring an unflattering photo of me taken outside the courthouse. The headline read, "Black Widow Swindles Elderly, Grieving Parents Out of Son's Inheritance." The article was a masterpiece of venom, painting me as a calculating manipulator who took advantage of John and Mary's grief. It quoted anonymous family sources who said I had isolated Mark from them, that my grief was an act, and that the trust document was likely forged or signed under duress. Their narrative was perverse. They, the heartbroken parents, only wanted to preserve their only son's legacy, and I, the greedy wife, had thrown them out onto the street. My stomach turned. It was the same tactic they'd used before, painting me as unstable, but now amplified for a public audience. The calls started coming. Distant aunts and cousins of Mark's, sputtering with righteous anger, asking how I could be so cruel. The neighbors who had once looked at me with pity now looked with suspicion. I was being isolated all over again, not inside my house, but inside my own life. Mr. Harrison, my lawyer, was furious. "This is libel, pure and simple," he said over the phone. "But suing them is going to be expensive and drag this out even longer. They have nothing left to lose, Clara. That's why they're fighting so dirty." It got worse when I was served with a legal notice. It wasn't from John and Mary, but from a distant cousin of Mark's, a man named Gary whom I barely knew. Gary, with the financial backing and poisonous guidance of my in-laws, was contesting the validity of the trust. His argument was weak. He claimed Mark was not of sound mind when he created it, but that wasn't the point. The point was to drag me into expensive litigation, to bleed my resources, and use the discovery process to dig up any dirt they could find on me. John and Mary had found a proxy. Since they had been explicitly disinherited by the interorum clause, they couldn't sue themselves. But they could fund and manipulate someone else to do it. It was a clever, vicious way to sidestep Mark's trap. I felt a wave of hopelessness wash over me. Would this never end? I had followed Mark's plan. I had won, but the victory felt like a mirage. "Mark," I whispered into the empty house one night, "what do I do now? Your plan wasn't enough." It was in that moment of despair that I remembered something. Mark's letter. He had written, "I set this up as a shield for you." This, singular, referring to the trust. But the way he had lived his life, always thinking 2 steps ahead of his parents, made me wonder. Would Mark, my brilliant, careful diplomat, really be so short-sighted as to think a single weapon would solve a lifelong war? A new energy surged through me. It wasn't despair, it was purpose. The trust wasn't the end of the plan. It was Act 1. What if Mark, knowing how vindictive his parents could be, had left in Act 2? I started a methodical search. This time, I wasn't looking for a hidden envelope. I was looking for a pattern, a clue, something only I would understand. I spent days sifting through Mark's old files, his books, his hobbies. Nothing. I felt defeated again, sitting on the floor of his home office, surrounded by boxes of paperwork. My gaze landed on his old laptop. He had protected it with a password I never knew. I had tried the usuals, my birthday, his birthday, our dog's name. Nothing worked. I looked up at the bookshelf above the desk. There was a collection of hardcover classics he loved. One book in particular stood out because it was just slightly misaligned. The Count of Monte Cristo. The story of a man wrongfully imprisoned who engineers a meticulous, long-game revenge. Mark used to joke it was the ultimate manual on how to settle a score. I pulled the book down. On the flyleaf, in a tiny pencil notation, was a string of numbers. 24601. A chill went down my spine. It was Jean Valjean's prisoner number from Les Miserables, another of his favorites. But why here? Then I saw something else. On page 24, the sixth word was faintly underlined. On page 60, the first word, it was a code. It took me hours to decipher it, my heart pounding with a mixture of awe and grief. Awe at my husband's brilliance, and grief that he felt he had to do this at all. The decoded password was, "Revenge is a dish best served cold." With trembling hands, I typed it into the laptop. It worked. The desktop was clean except for a single folder named Insurance Policy. Inside, there were no legal documents. There were audio files and scans of old accounting ledgers. I clicked on the first audio file. Mark's voice filled the room, recorded months before his death. "If you're listening to this, Clara," he said, his voice calm and sad, "it means they didn't stop. I hoped they would, but I knew they probably wouldn't." He went on to explain. The reason his father, John, was so controlling and obsessed with money was because he was broke. Years ago, John had been caught embezzling funds from his own family's company, nearly driving it into bankruptcy. His brother, Mark's uncle, found out, but to avoid a public scandal, agreed not to press charges if John paid it all back. Mark discovered this by accident, and it was a secret he had used as silent leverage for years to keep his father's worst instincts in check. John lived in constant fear of exposure and ruin. Mark's inheritance wasn't about legacy. It was his father's last, desperate bid to reclaim his financial standing. The other files were the proof. Scans of the doctored ledgers, recordings of conversations where Mark confronted his father, who admitted everything. This wasn't a sword. It was a failsafe. And the letter in the trust, that was just the detonator for stage 1. This was the final weapon, meant to be used only if his parents refused to accept defeat. He hadn't wanted to destroy his father, only to contain him. But he had given me the power to do it if I had to. Mr. Harrison listened to the audio files in his office, his shark smile returning in full force. "I told you your husband was a smart man," he said, shaking his head in admiration. He was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. He anticipated their counter-move. This time, there was no phone call. Mr. Harrison drafted an email. It was sent to Gary's lawyer, with John and Mary CC'd. The email was short. It announced that we had uncovered new evidence pertinent to the character of the lawsuit's primary financier, Mr. John Miller. Attached was a single audio file, John's 30-second confession to Mark. The email ended with a simple offer. Drop the lawsuit, sign a binding non-disclosure agreement that forbade them from ever contacting me or mentioning my name in public again, and the remaining files would stay private. If they proceeded, a full copy of their insurance policy would be sent to the relevant authorities and every member of the Miller family. The silence that followed was deeper than the last time. It lasted a full day. The next morning, Gary's lawyer called. The lawsuit was dropped. The settlement papers were being drafted. Gary, it turned out, had no idea about his uncle's criminality and wanted to distance himself as quickly as possible. But I needed one more thing. I needed to look at them one last time. Against Mr. Harrison's advice, I asked for a final meeting. They agreed, reluctantly. We met in the sterile conference room of Mr. Harrison's office. They looked 10 years older. John was gray and shrunken. Mary stared at her hands, her mask of theatrical pain replaced with a hollow shame. There was no anger in my voice, just an icy calm. "You could have had everything," I said quietly. "You could have been grandparents to my future children. You could have shared in Mark's memories. All you had to do was be decent. But you couldn't." John looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "He was my son," he whispered. "He was my husband," I countered. "And he spent his life protecting me from you, and he continued to do it even after he was gone." The first document was a shield. "This," I said, tapping my phone where the files were stored, "was what he left to make sure you could never hurt anyone again. Sign the papers." And they did. Without a word, they stood and walked out, not as defeated tyrants, but as the pathetic ghosts they truly were. As I walked out of the building into the sunshine, I felt a lightness I had never known. It wasn't the triumph of revenge. It was the quiet of final justice. Mark hadn't left me a battle plan for war. He had left me a map to peace, even if I had to walk through hell to find it. My sanctuary was finally, truly, safe. If this story left you speechless, smash that like button right now. Tell me in the comments, was justice served, or did I go too far? And don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss next week's chilling confession.